Have you noticed that every time your life starts moving toward peace, something suddenly goes wrong? This is not a coincidence. God is revealing something that most chosen ones never realize until it's almost too late. Someone, whether they know it or not, is still being used to delay your sacred union. Not destroy it. Delay it. Because heaven has already written your reunion. But before two divine souls can stand together, every false attachment, every hidden manipulation, every soul tie rooted in fear must be exposed. You may have blamed yourself, wondered why every relationship collapsed, why your twin flame always seemed just one step away, why every breakthrough was followed by confusion, betrayal, or unexpected separation. Today, God wants you to stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "Who benefits if I never discover who I truly am?" Because the answer changes everything. Stay until the end, because there's a message many people will ignore. But if this video found you today, it may be the confirmation your spirit has been praying for. Have you noticed that every time your life finally begins to feel peaceful, something unexpected suddenly appears to pull you backward? Just when you begin healing, an old relationship resurfaces. Just when you stop obsessing over the past, someone from your history sends an unexpected message. Just when your faith becomes stronger, doubt whispers louder than ever before. If this pattern feels strangely familiar, don't dismiss it as coincidence. According to the message you were meant to hear today, God is revealing something many chosen ones fail to recognize until they are standing on the edge of their greatest breakthrough. Someone is still trying to delay your sacred union. Notice the word carefully. Not destroy it. Not erase it. Delay it. Because what God has ordained cannot be canceled by human hands. It can be resisted. It can be challenged. It can even appear hidden for a season. But what heaven has written cannot be rewritten by fear, jealousy, manipulation, or darkness. That is exactly why the opposition changes its strategy. When it cannot steal your destiny, it tries to exhaust your faith before you reach it. Perhaps you've spent months, or even years, asking yourself painful questions. Why does every meaningful relationship suddenly fall apart? Why do people leave when I finally begin trusting them? Why does it seem like love keeps slipping away just when it feels close enough to touch? You may have blamed your personality. You may have questioned your worth. You may have wondered whether God had forgotten you altogether. But what if you've been asking the wrong question? What if the real question is this? Who benefits if you never discover the divine assignment attached to your sacred union? Because this journey has never been only about romance. It has never been merely about finding someone who understands you. It has always been about two souls carrying complementary assignments that become exponentially stronger when united under God's timing. That is why the preparation feels so intense. The enemy doesn't waste energy attacking what carries no purpose. Storms don't gather around empty fields. They gather around harvests. And if you've experienced one obstacle after another, perhaps it isn't proof that you're abandoned. Perhaps it's evidence that you're approaching something incredibly valuable. Imagine an ancient kingdom preparing to crown its next ruler. The closer the coronation day becomes, the tighter the security grows. More guards. More inspections. More attempts from enemies outside the palace walls. Not because the king is weak, but because everyone understands how significant that moment will be. Your spiritual life often follows the same pattern. The closer you move toward divine alignment, the greater the resistance can appear. Not because God is losing control, but because heaven knows exactly what is about to unfold. Many chosen ones mistakenly interpret resistance as rejection. They assume every delay means God has changed his mind. Yet Scripture repeatedly shows something different. Before Joseph entered the palace, he entered the prison. Before David wore the crown, he hid in caves. Before Moses led a nation, he wandered through the wilderness. Preparation almost never feels like promotion. It usually feels like isolation, confusion, waiting, silence. And that's exactly where many people lose hope. Because silence can feel like absence. But silence does not always mean inactivity. Think about a seed buried beneath the soil. From the surface, nothing appears to be happening. No leaves. No branches. No visible progress. Someone walking by might assume the seed has died. Yet beneath the darkness, invisible roots are stretching deeper every single day. The greatest transformations are almost always hidden before they become visible. Could the same be true for your journey? Could it be that while you've been mourning what disappeared, heaven has been quietly preparing what is permanent? Many people watching today have experienced an unusual cycle. Every time life starts improving, chaos suddenly arrives. Unexpected arguments, broken friendships, financial pressure, emotional confusion, strange discouragement, even unexplained exhaustion. It's tempting to assume life is simply unfair. But sometimes disruption happens because hidden attachments are being exposed before they can enter your next season. Think about construction workers restoring the foundation of an old house. The process looks destructive. Walls are removed. Floors are broken apart. Dust fills every room. Anyone observing halfway through might conclude the house is being demolished. Yet the architect already sees the finished masterpiece. God often works like that. He removes before he rebuilds. He uncovers before he heals. He separates before he unites. And perhaps that's the message your spirit has needed all along. Because someone may still be attempting to delay your progress, not necessarily through obvious attacks, but through subtle distractions. Distractions that seem harmless. Old emotional patterns. Lingering guilt. Fear disguised as wisdom. Comfort disguised as peace. Relationships that keep you emotionally occupied but spiritually stagnant. Sometimes the greatest obstacle isn't a dramatic battle. It's a quiet compromise repeated every single day. A thought that whispers, maybe you're asking for too much. Another says, maybe love like that doesn't exist. Then another, maybe you've already missed your chance. But none of those voices sound like God. God convicts. Fear condemns. God brings clarity. Fear creates confusion. God leads with peace. Fear pushes with urgency. Learning to recognize that difference changes everything. And here's something even more remarkable. The people involved in delaying your journey may not even realize they're doing it. Not everyone who slows your progress is intentionally working against you. Some are simply acting from their own wounds, their own fears, their own unresolved pain. A person who has never experienced unconditional love may unintentionally discourage someone who is finally learning to receive it. Someone trapped in scarcity may mock your faith because abundance feels impossible to them. Someone afraid of change may encourage you to remain exactly where God is asking you to leave. Discernment becomes essential, because not every familiar voice deserves permanent access to your future. As your sacred union draws closer, your spiritual sensitivity also increases. You'll begin noticing things you previously ignored. Conversations that suddenly feel heavy. Places that drain your peace. Habits that no longer fit who you're becoming. This isn't because you're becoming better than others. It's because your spirit is learning the difference between what nurtures your purpose and what quietly delays it. And that awareness is one of heaven's greatest gifts. Perhaps that's why this message found you today. Not by accident. Not because an algorithm happened to recommend another video, but because somewhere deep within your soul, you've been asking heaven for confirmation. You've prayed quietly. You've cried when no one else was watching. You've wondered if all the waiting had any meaning. Today, God reminds you that waiting does not mean forgetting. Delay does not mean denial. Silence does not mean abandonment. There are movements happening beyond what your physical eyes can see. Doors are being positioned. Hearts are being transformed. Old chains are being broken. Divine appointments are being arranged with precision you cannot yet imagine. Your responsibility is not to control every step. Your responsibility is to remain faithful while heaven finishes what only heaven can accomplish. So before you assume another disappointment means you've lost your destiny, remember this truth. The enemy only delays what he cannot permanently destroy. And if your sacred union still faces resistance, perhaps it's because its purpose reaches far beyond the happiness of two people. Perhaps your reunion carries healing that will touch countless lives. Perhaps your testimony will become someone else's reason to keep believing. So don't measure God's promises by today's circumstances. Measure today's circumstances against God's promises. Because what He has spoken over your life has not expired. It is still alive, still moving, still unfolding. And in the chapters ahead, we're going to uncover exactly who, or what, has been standing in the way, why God has allowed this season of waiting, and how you can recognize the unmistakable signs that your sacred union is closer than it has ever been before. There is a kind of pain that does not break you immediately. It builds slowly, quietly, layer by layer, until one day you realize you've been carrying something heavier than most people can see. And if you're watching this right now, you might recognize that feeling, not because it is new, but because it has followed you for a long time. You've learned how to smile while carrying questions you never fully answer. You've learned how to show up for others while silently wondering why no one seems to show up for you in the same way. You've learned how to function in a world that often feels slightly out of sync with your inner reality. And deep down, you've probably asked yourself at least once, why does my life feel like this? Not in a dramatic way, but in those quiet moments when everything goes still, and you can no longer distract yourself from what you feel. The truth is, many chosen ones don't feel lost. They feel misplaced. Like they were born into a story that doesn't quite match their spirit. And that mismatch creates a lifelong tension that most people cannot explain. You may have experienced moments like this. Being in a room full of people and still feeling alone. Sharing your thoughts and realizing no one truly understands what you mean. Trying to express your heart and feeling like your words land somewhere far away from where they were meant to go. Over time, that creates something deeper than sadness. It creates emotional silence. A quiet withdrawal from the world. Not because you don't care, but because caring too deeply has cost you too much. And yet, even after everything, something inside you refused to shut down. That is not weakness. That is evidence of something rare. Because most people adapt to environments that hurt them. They lower their expectations. They reduce their sensitivity. They choose comfort over truth. But you didn't fully do that. Even when it would have been easier. Even when it would have protected you from disappointment. You kept feeling. You kept hoping. You kept believing that something real still existed beneath all the confusion. And that persistence is exactly what sets your path apart. But it also explains why your journey has felt so heavy. Because the more aligned your soul becomes with truth, the harder it becomes to stay in places built on illusion. That is why many chosen ones experience repeated cycles of connection followed by separation, hope followed by disappointment, closeness followed by sudden emotional distance. At first, it feels random. Then it feels personal. Then it starts to feel like a pattern you cannot escape. And eventually you begin to wonder if the problem is you. But what if it isn't? What if your sensitivity is not the flaw, but the signal? What if your emotional depth is not the reason you suffer, but the reason you cannot stay where superficial connections are the norm? Because here is something most people never realize. The same trait that makes you capable of divine connection also makes ordinary environments feel unbearable. You notice what others ignore. You feel what others suppress. You sense shifts in energy before anything is spoken. And while that might sound like a gift, and it is, it also means you experience emotional contrast more intensely than most people ever will. This is why your life has not felt normal. Because you were never designed for emotional numbness. You were designed for alignment. And alignment always begins with discomfort. Think about it. Every time you have grown in your life, it likely came after something painful. A betrayal that forced you to see clearly. A loss that pushed you inward. A rejection that redirected your path. At the time, it felt like destruction. But later, you realized it was redirection. And yet, even knowing that, there are moments when the pain still feels personal. Especially when it comes from people you trusted. People you believed understood you. people you thought were aligned with your heart. That kind of pain hits differently, because it doesn't just hurt your emotions. It shakes your perception of truth. It makes you question your judgment. It makes you wonder whether you can trust your own intuition. And once that doubt enters, everything becomes heavier. You start second-guessing your feelings. You hesitate before opening up. You analyze people instead of connecting with them. You begin to live in a state of emotional self-protection. But here is what is important to understand. That protection was never your final state. It was your survival phase. A temporary shield, not your identity. And even though it may have helped you endure what you went through, it was never meant to define your future relationships. Because the sacred union that God is preparing for you cannot grow in a space of fear. It requires openness. It requires trust. It requires emotional honesty without defense mechanisms built from past wounds. And that is why your journey has included so much inner cleansing. Not to punish you, but to prepare you. There is also something else happening that many chosen ones don't recognize while they are in it. You are not only healing from people. You are also healing from patterns. Patterns of overgiving. Patterns of emotional dependence. Patterns of trying to earn love through effort instead of receiving it through alignment. And those patterns often resist change more than actual people do. Because patterns live in memory, in habit, in unconscious repetition. That is why even after someone leaves your life, you may still feel the emotional residue of what they represented. Not because you want them back, but because your system is still recalibrating, still learning, still releasing. And during that process, silence becomes a teacher. Loneliness becomes a mirror. Distance becomes a form of clarity. You may have thought the distance you experienced meant abandonment. But in many cases, it was actually exposure. Exposure of what cannot enter your next level. Exposure of what was never aligned with your long-term path. And exposure of what must be released before something real can stay. That is why certain connections feel like they collapse suddenly, without warning. One moment, everything seems stable. The next moment, everything shifts. And you are left trying to understand what changed. But often, what changed was not the situation. It was your awareness. You began to see clearly. And clarity always changes the dynamic of illusions. Still, I know this part of your journey can feel exhausting. Because healing is not linear. Some days you feel strong. Some days you feel like you are starting over. Some days you feel disconnected from everything you once believed. And in those moments, it is easy to assume you are going backward. But spiritual growth rarely looks like forward motion. It looks like spirals, returning to the same themes, but with deeper understanding each time. And if you are still here, still listening, still searching for meaning in what you've experienced, that itself is not random. It is evidence that something within you refuses to settle for anything less than truth. Because deep inside, beyond all the confusion, beyond all the emotional fatigue, beyond all the unanswered questions, there is still a part of you that knows. Your story is not ordinary. Your path is not accidental. And your pain has been shaping something that cannot be seen yet, but will eventually become undeniable. And in the next chapter, we will go deeper into what this hidden resistance actually is, why it seems to appear at the exact moment you are closest to breakthrough, and how God is silently restructuring your entire timeline for a union that cannot be delayed forever. There comes a moment on every spiritual journey when confusion is no longer the hardest part. The hardest part is discernment. Because you begin to realize that not everything blocking your path looks like an obstacle. Some of it looks like timing. Some of it looks like logic. Some of it even looks like protection. And that is where the real test begins. If you are watching this right now, it may be because you are standing in that exact place, the space between what you feel in your spirit and what your external reality seems to confirm. On the inside, something tells you your sacred union is real. But on the outside, things still feel delayed, uncertain, or strangely interrupted right before breakthrough moments. You may have even asked yourself, if this is truly meant for me, why does it feel like something keeps stopping it? The answer is not as simple as one enemy or one situation. Because what you are dealing with is not just resistance. It is layered resistance. Some of it is external. Some of it is internal. And some of it is what heaven allows, not to punish you, but to refine the timing so nothing enters your life before it is fully ready to stay. There is a spiritual principle many chosen ones slowly begin to recognize over time. What is truly aligned does not arrive early. And what is not aligned cannot arrive permanently. So what looks like delay is often divine filtering. But here is where things become deeper. Because there is also another type of resistance, one that is far more subtle. It is not always people actively opposing your destiny. It is patterns that still have access to your emotional system. Old attachments that still echo in your subconscious. Unhealed expectations that quietly influence your decisions. And invisible agreements you made during seasons when you didn't yet understand your own worth. These things don't scream. They whisper. They repeat familiar emotional scripts. They recreate familiar cycles. And without realizing it, they can pull you back into versions of life you have already outgrown. This is why certain opportunities in your life felt like they almost became something, but then collapsed right at the final moment. It is why certain relationships felt meant to be, until suddenly they weren't. And it is why certain people reappear at the exact time you begin stepping into clarity. Not always because they are intentionally interfering, but because unfinished emotional loops tend to activate when transformation is near. Think of it like invisible gravity. When your life begins to shift upward, everything unresolved around you becomes noticeable. Old energy doesn't disappear quietly. It gets exposed. And exposure can feel like chaos if you don't understand what is happening beneath the surface. That is why many chosen ones misinterpret this phase. They assume, if things keep falling apart, maybe I'm going in the wrong direction. But in spiritual truth, sometimes things fall apart precisely because you are finally moving in the right direction. Because alignment threatens everything built on misalignment. And misalignment does not leave peacefully. It resists. It distorts. It delays. But it cannot ultimately override what heaven has already established. There is a reason Scripture repeatedly shows that divine promise is often surrounded by interruption before manifestation. Not because the promise is uncertain, but because the preparation must be complete before the promise becomes sustainable. You are not being tested to see if you are worthy. You are being stabilized so you don't lose what you are about to receive. Because some blessings don't fail because they are wrong. They fail because the person receiving them wasn't ready to hold the weight of their fulfillment. That is the part most people never consider. They assume delay is punishment. But sometimes delay is protection from premature collapse. And yet, even understanding that intellectually doesn't always remove the emotional frustration of waiting. Especially when you can feel something shifting. There are moments in your journey where intuition becomes sharper. Where synchronicities increase. Where emotional detachment from the past begins naturally. Where certain people lose access to your inner world without you even trying. And in those moments, something inside you says, it is close. But then the external world doesn't immediately confirm it. And that gap between inner knowing and outer silence becomes the most difficult space to hold. Because silence can feel like contradiction. But silence is often where restructuring happens. Imagine a construction site at night. From the outside, nothing appears to be happening. The building is still. Quiet. Dark. But inside, work continues. Foundations are reinforced. Weak structures are removed. New frameworks are installed. You do not see it, but everything is changing. That is often what divine timing looks like. Not constant visible progress, but invisible preparation. And while this preparation unfolds, something else is also happening that most people overlook. Certain paths are being closed without announcement. Not every door shuts loudly. Some simply stop responding. Some slowly lose alignment. Some feel increasingly unnatural to walk through. And instead of dramatic endings, you experience gradual disconnection. This is not rejection. It is redirection without confusion. Because heaven does not always remove things in a way that destroys your peace. Sometimes it removes them in a way that simply makes them no longer fit. And when something no longer fits, forcing it creates unnecessary suffering. This is why surrender becomes essential, not as a passive state, but as active trust. Trust that what is leaving is not your loss. And what is coming cannot be forced open before its time. But here is the most important part of this chapter. There is also a resistance that is not just around you, but within the collective timeline of your connection. Meaning, both paths involved in your sacred union are undergoing synchronization. Not just you. Not just them. Both. And synchronization is rarely simultaneous. One soul often awakens first. The other often follows through experience, challenge, or distance. And during that phase, separation becomes a necessary gap. Not because love is absent, but because growth is uneven. And uneven growth cannot maintain stable union. So heaven pauses convergence until balance is restored. This is why you may feel like something is almost ready, yet still not visible. Because readiness is not just emotional. It is spiritual maturity aligning on both sides of the connection. And that alignment cannot be rushed by desire. Only prepared through experience. That is why your journey has included contrast, distance, reflection, and repeated cycles of release. Each one shaping a version of you that is no longer driven by fear of loss, but anchored in inner stability. Because sacred union is not built on emotional dependency. It is built on completeness meeting completeness. Not half seeking half, but two whole paths converging at the right moment in divine order. And even though it may not feel like it right now, something deeper is unfolding beneath your visible reality. The timeline is not broken. It is being reorganized. Connections are not failing. They are being filtered. Delays are not random. They are coordinated adjustments within a larger design you cannot yet fully see. And the more you resist confusion, the more clarity begins to form. Because clarity is not something you force. It is something that arrives when you stop assuming chaos means absence of order. So if you are still in a season where nothing feels fully resolved, yet everything feels spiritually active, that is not stagnation. That is transition. And transitions always feel uncertain from the inside. But they always make sense from the other side. In the final chapter ahead, everything begins to converge. Why the delay has felt so persistent, what signs confirm that the shift is already happening, and how you can recognize when heaven has officially released your sacred union into manifestation rather than preparation. There is a point in every long spiritual waiting season where something begins to shift so quietly that you almost miss it. Not because it is dramatic, but because it feels natural. Too natural. After so long expecting resistance, confusion, and emotional turbulence, peace can feel unfamiliar at first. And yet, that is often the first real sign that the delay is ending. If you are still listening right now, it may be because you are standing at the threshold of that shift, the moment where heaven begins releasing what has been held in preparation. But here is what most people misunderstand. The release of a sacred union is not a sudden event. It is the final phase of alignment that has been building beneath the surface all along. And by the time it becomes visible externally, it has already been completed internally. This is why many chosen ones only recognize their breakthrough after it has already begun. Because transformation does not announce itself. It reveals itself through evidence. And the first evidence is always subtle. A calmness where anxiety used to live. A sense of certainty where confusion once dominated. A quiet detachment from things that used to feel emotionally consuming. You may notice that certain memories no longer trigger the same emotional intensity. You may feel less pulled toward people or situations that once felt impossible to release. And without trying, you begin to feel lighter, not because everything is perfect, but because something within you has been resolved. This is not emotional detachment caused by avoidance. It is emotional completion. And completion is one of the clearest signs that a cycle is ending. But there is something deeper happening at the same time. While your internal world is stabilizing, external alignment begins adjusting in parallel. Situations that once felt blocked suddenly begin to move. Conversations that were once avoided become possible. Doors that previously remained closed begin to show signs of responsiveness. Not all at once, but in sequence, as if reality itself is reorganizing step by step. This is what divine timing actually looks like in motion. Not explosive change, but coordinated unfolding. And yet, even in this phase, doubt can still appear. Because after long periods of waiting, the nervous system learns to expect interruption. So even when things begin to improve, part of you may hesitate to fully trust it. You may find yourself thinking, is this real this time? Or is it going to disappear again? That hesitation is understandable. Because repeated cycles of hope followed by disappointment leave emotional residue. But here is something important to recognize. Healing does not require perfection to be real. It only requires consistency in a new direction. And once that consistency begins, heaven does not reset the process. It continues it. One of the most significant signs that sacred union alignment is approaching is the reduction of unnecessary emotional noise. Drama decreases. Internal conflict softens. Overthinking loses its intensity. You begin to notice that your energy is no longer constantly pulled in multiple directions. Instead, there is a growing sense of focus. Even if life is not fully resolved externally, your inner world begins to stabilize in a way that feels unfamiliar but deeply grounded. This stability is not accidental. It is preparation for emotional maturity within union. Because sacred union cannot thrive in emotional chaos. It requires two individuals who are no longer ruled by fear-based reactions. This is why the final phase of delay often includes emotional purification. Not punishment, but simplification. The removal of everything that cannot coexist with peace. And in that simplification, something profound happens. You begin to recognize your own evolution. You realize you no longer react the same way to things that once controlled your emotions. You no longer chase clarity in the same desperate way. You no longer feel the same urgency to force outcomes. Instead, you begin to trust timing in a way that feels grounded, not forced. And this shift is one of the clearest indicators that the preparation phase is ending. Because desperation cannot enter the space of divine fulfillment. It dissolves before arrival. At the same time, something may also begin to happen in the external connection tied to your sacred union. A reappearance, a reconnection, or simply a noticeable energetic shift where the distance no longer feels as absolute as before. Even if no physical interaction occurs yet, the emotional field changes. It becomes less heavy, less final, less closed. This is often where synchronicities increase again. Not as confusion, but as confirmation. You may notice repeated numbers. Dreams that feel unusually vivid or emotionally meaningful. Unexpected reminders of the person or connection you thought was fading. But the purpose of these signs is not to create obsession. It is to confirm alignment. Because when heaven prepares to reconnect two paths, it often begins by aligning their awareness. Both individuals begin thinking differently, reflecting differently, feeling differently, even if they cannot yet explain why. This is synchronization before convergence. And convergence does not happen randomly. It happens when both paths reach internal readiness. Not identical readiness, but compatible readiness. That distinction matters. Because sacred union is not about two perfectly healed individuals. It is about two individuals who have reached a level of emotional and spiritual maturity where union no longer destroys their progress, but enhances it. That is why timing has felt so precise. Even painful delays had structure. Even separation had purpose. Even silence had direction. Because everything was preparing for a version of connection that can actually last. And now, as you approach this final stage, something else becomes clear. The resistance that once felt overwhelming begins to lose influence. Situations that used to drain, you no longer have the same emotional authority. People who once occupied your inner space begin to fade in importance. not through force, but through natural release. This is what happens when alignment overtakes attachment. And in that transition, clarity emerges. You begin to see your path more simply, not because life becomes easier, but because your perception becomes clearer. And clarity is what allows movement. At this stage, many chosen ones experience what feels like a strange emotional neutrality. Not sadness, not excitement, but peace mixed with anticipation. A sense that something is about to shift, even if nothing external confirms it yet. This is one of the final pre-manifestation states, where the internal alignment is complete, but external manifestation is still unfolding. And this is where trust becomes the final requirement. Not blind trust, but experienced trust. Trust that has been tested through delay, confusion, and emotional refinement. Trust that does not depend on immediate proof, but on accumulated understanding of how your life has consistently moved you forward, even when it didn't feel like it. Because if you look back carefully, you will likely see a pattern. What once felt like rejection later revealed itself as redirection. What once felt like loss later created space for growth. What once felt like delay later prevented destruction. And what once felt like silence later revealed divine timing. Nothing has been random. Even the hardest parts had structure. And now, that structure is beginning to reveal its final form. So if you are sensing change, subtle, quiet, but undeniable, it is not imagination. It is transition becoming visible. It is preparation completing its cycle. It is heaven aligning what could not be forced into what is now ready to be received. And in this final understanding, everything begins to make sense. The waiting was not wasted. The delay was not denial. The separation was not abandonment. It was alignment in progress. And as this chapter closes, the message becomes simple but powerful. What has been held back is not gone. What has been delayed is not lost. And what heaven has prepared for you is now moving toward the moment of release. Because sacred union, when truly ordained, does not end in delay. It ends in fulfillment. There is a final stage in every divine process where waiting no longer feels like waiting. It feels like knowing. Not the kind of knowing that comes from logic. Not the kind that depends on external confirmation. But the kind that settles deep in your spirit like something ancient being remembered. If you are here right now, it may be because you are entering that final threshold, the moment where sacred union shifts from preparation into inevitability. And once something becomes inevitable in divine timing, it no longer depends on circumstances to survive. It simply unfolds. Quietly. Naturally. Unstoppably. But before that unfolding becomes visible, something profound happens within you first. You stop searching for signs the way you used to. You stop analyzing every detail for hidden meaning. You stop waiting for confirmation before allowing yourself to feel peace. And instead, something unexpected replaces all of that. A deep internal certainty that no longer asks permission to exist. This is not emotional imagination. It is spiritual completion reaching its final form. Because every long delay you have experienced was not leading you away from your sacred union. It was leading you into the version of yourself capable of receiving it without self-destruction. That distinction is everything. Many people assume sacred union is about finding the right person. But what you are discovering is far more precise. It is about becoming the right version of yourself so that alignment can remain stable when it arrives. And that stability is what heaven has been building all along. Every heartbreak, every separation, every silence, every moment of confusion that forced you inward instead of outward. None of it was random. It was calibration. A gradual restructuring of your emotional foundation so that what is sacred can no longer destabilize you, but instead elevate you. And now something changes. Not suddenly, but unmistakably. You begin to feel less emotionally reactive to your past. Situations that once pulled you into overthinking no longer hold the same weight. Memories still exist, but they no longer control your present emotional state. It is as if your spirit has finally stepped outside of an old loop. And from that new vantage point, you can see your entire journey differently. You realize that what once felt like chaos was actually coordination. What once felt like rejection was protection from misalignment. What once felt like abandonment was space being created for something more precise. And this shift in perception is not small. It is transformational. Because perception determines emotional reality. And emotional reality determines what you are able to receive. At this stage, many chosen ones experience something subtle but powerful. Life begins to feel quieter inside, even if nothing externally has changed yet. The emotional storms that used to define your inner world begin to fade. Not because life has become easier, but because your internal system is no longer amplifying fear. And when fear stops amplifying, clarity begins to dominate. This clarity brings something new. You stop needing to chase closure. Because you realize closure was never something another person could give you. It was something your spirit had to arrive at on its own. And you have arrived. Not perfectly. Not completely without doubt. But sufficiently enough that you no longer abandon yourself in search of answers outside of you. This is one of the final signs that sacred union energy is stabilizing. Because union cannot exist in a consciousness that is constantly fractured by uncertainty. It requires inner cohesion. And that cohesion is what you have been slowly building without even realizing it. But there is another layer to this final stage that is often misunderstood. As your internal alignment strengthens, external reality begins to shift in parallel. Not always dramatically. Sometimes subtly. Almost imperceptibly at first. But patterns begin to change. Old cycles stop repeating in the same way. Unexpected calm replaces familiar instability. And situations that once felt stuck begin to loosen. This is not coincidence. It is synchronization between inner and outer timelines. Because when your internal frequency changes significantly, external alignment has no choice but to respond. It cannot remain frozen in a version of reality you have already outgrown. And this is where many chosen ones begin to notice something extraordinary. What used to feel delayed starts to feel inevitable. Not because it suddenly appears, but because the resistance no longer feels dominant. And without resistance, flow becomes natural. You may also begin to notice emotional echoes connected to your sacred union. A sense that something is close. A quiet feeling of anticipation without anxiety. A softness in the energy around love and connection that was not there before. Even if no physical reunion has happened yet, the emotional distance begins to feel less absolute. Less final. Less permanent. This is often the first sign that convergence is forming. Because before two paths meet externally, they begin to align internally. Thought patterns shift. Emotional patterns soften. Unconscious resistance dissolves. And without either person forcing it, the connection begins to reorganize itself. Not through effort, but through readiness. At this stage, even silence begins to feel different. Earlier in your journey, silence felt heavy. It felt like absence. Like uncertainty. Like unanswered questions pressing against your mind. But now, silence feels structured. It feels purposeful. It feels like something is happening beneath it, even if you cannot yet see it. And you are right. Because silence is often where divine convergence is finalized. Where timing locks into place. Where unnecessary interference is removed. Where two paths are quietly brought into synchronization without disruption. This is why the final phase often feels strangely peaceful. Not because everything is fully visible, but because something within you finally trusts that what is unfolding does not require control. Only readiness. And readiness is the last threshold before manifestation. At this point, the most important shift is internal. You no longer define your future by your past delays. You no longer interpret pauses as permanent stops. You no longer assume uncertainty means absence of direction. Instead, you begin to recognize a deeper truth. Everything has been moving, even when you could not see it. And that realization changes how you hold your entire journey. Because you are no longer waiting in fear. You are observing in awareness. and awareness is the state in which divine timing becomes visible. In this final chapter of your preparation, something becomes clear that may have taken you years to understand. The sacred union was never on pause. It was being refined. Every delay was precision. Every separation was protection. Every silence was alignment behind the veil. And now, as everything converges, the final message is no longer about waiting. It is about recognition. Recognition that what was promised has not disappeared. Recognition that what was prepared has not been lost. And recognition that what has been shaped through time is now approaching the moment of expression. Because when heaven decides a union is complete, no earthly delay can erase it. It can only prepare it. And once preparation is complete, the only thing left is fulfillment. Not as possibility, but as reality finally becoming visible. And as this final chapter closes, the message is simple but absolute. What was delayed is now aligning. What was hidden is now forming. And what was written in your destiny is no longer approaching. It is already unfolding. There is a moment in every long divine process when everything that was once invisible begins to take form in the physical world. Not suddenly in a chaotic way, but in a way that feels almost inevitable. Like something that was always meant to happen has finally reached the point where it can no longer remain unseen. If you are here right now, it may be because you are standing at that threshold, the final passage between spiritual preparation and physical manifestation. And this is where everything changes. Because up until this point, your journey has been mostly internal. Healing, realization, separation, awakening, alignment. But now something different begins. What was once only felt in the spirit starts echoing in reality. Not as imagination, not as hope, but as movement. Subtle at first, then undeniable. And the strange part is that it does not feel like something new is being created. It feels like something that already existed is finally becoming visible. That is the nature of divine timing when it reaches completion. It does not invent destiny. It reveals it. And yet, even in this stage, many chosen ones feel a strange hesitation. Because after so long in preparation, the nervous system does not immediately trust stability. You may find yourself questioning, is this really happening? Or am I just interpreting things differently again? That doubt is not failure. It is the final echo of an old identity that no longer fits your current alignment. Because a version of you spent a long time surviving delay. And that version is not used to receiving. But now, receiving is exactly what is beginning. And receiving requires a different internal posture. Not chasing. Not analyzing. Not forcing understanding. But allowing. And allowing is often the most unfamiliar state after long seasons of waiting. In this final phase, something begins to shift in the emotional atmosphere around your sacred union connection. Even if nothing has fully manifested physically yet, the energy is no longer static. There is movement in the unseen layers. A loosening, a softening, a reopening of pathways that once felt permanently closed. You may notice that memories surface differently. Not with pain, but with neutrality. As if the emotional charge that once surrounded them is dissolving. This is not forgetting. This is integration. And integration is what makes physical manifestation safe. Because what is unresolved internally cannot stabilize externally. But what has been integrated no longer creates resistance. And without resistance, flow becomes natural. At the same time, something else begins to happen that many chosen ones find confusing at first. Life starts to rearrange itself around you. Not in dramatic upheaval, but in quiet restructuring. Old priorities shift. New opportunities emerge unexpectedly. Certain people drift further away without conflict. Others reappear without explanation. And what once felt scattered begins to feel more intentional. This is what happens when divine timing transitions into physical activation. The internal alignment you completed earlier now begins influencing your external environment. Because reality always reorganizes itself around a stabilized frequency. Not immediately, but precisely, and in layers. This is why sacred union manifestation rarely appears as a single moment. It appears as a sequence, a series of confirmations that gradually build into undeniable realization. One sign alone may be subtle, but patterns are not. And patterns are how heaven communicates that something is no longer in preparation. It is in motion. At this stage, you may also experience something emotionally unusual. A calm expectation that does not feel like anxiety. You are no longer waiting in desperation. But you are also no longer detached. It is something in between. A grounded awareness that something significant is unfolding, even if you cannot yet define it fully. This emotional state is one of the clearest indicators that the final alignment phase has begun. Because fear-based waiting collapses before manifestation. And what replaces it is trust-based awareness. Another powerful sign in this stage is the reduction of internal conflict around the connection itself. Earlier in your journey, your mind may have oscillated between doubt and hope, between attachment and release, between believing and questioning. But now that internal duality begins to dissolve. You are no longer fighting yourself to understand what something means. You simply observe what is unfolding. And observation without internal resistance creates clarity. And clarity is what allows manifestation to solidify. Meanwhile, something subtle may also occur in relation to the sacred union energy itself. A feeling of nearness without contact. A sense that the connection is no longer emotionally distant in the same way it once was. Even without communication, there may be moments where the emotional field feels softer, more open, more receptive. This is often experienced as synchronicity increase again. Not as confusion, but as alignment confirmation. You may think of the person more frequently, but without emotional distress. You may dream more vividly, but without heaviness. You may notice reminders appearing in unexpected places, but without emotional destabilization. This is convergence energy beginning to stabilize. Because before physical union occurs, awareness aligns first. And awareness alignment is one of the final stages before external contact becomes natural rather than forced. But perhaps the most important shift in this chapter is internal. You stop defining your future by uncertainty. You stop treating delay as the dominant narrative. You stop interpreting silence as absence. And instead, you begin to hold a deeper truth. What is meant for you does not require chasing. It requires readiness. And readiness has now become your dominant state. This is the turning point many people miss. Because they are still emotionally living in the story of waiting, while reality has already moved into the story of arrival. And once arrival begins, everything that does not match it begins to fall away naturally. Old fears lose authority. Old doubts lose intensity. Old emotional loops lose influence. Not because you forced them out, but because they no longer belong to the version of you that is emerging. And that emerging version is no longer defined by what was lost, but by what is now becoming possible. At this stage, even your perception of time begins to shift. You no longer feel like you are waiting for something far away. Instead, you feel like something is unfolding in its own rhythm. Not ahead of you, not behind you, but within a synchronized process that you are now part of. This is divine timing in its most mature expression. Not anticipation, but participation. And participation requires surrender to flow. Not passive surrender, but conscious trust in movement you cannot fully control. And this is where everything begins to converge. Because sacred union, when fully activated, is not a single event. It is a realization that what was once fragmented is now aligning into wholeness. And that wholeness cannot remain invisible forever. It must express itself. In communication. In presence. In recognition. In timing that no longer feels delayed, but fulfilled. So if you are sensing that something is shifting, even if you cannot yet name it clearly, trust that this is not imagination. It is transition becoming reality. And as this final chapter closes, the message becomes clear. What was prepared in silence is now moving into form. What was aligned in spirit is now reflecting in the physical world. And what heaven has held for the right timing is no longer waiting. It is arriving. There is a final moment in every divine journey where hope is no longer needed. Not because hope was wrong, but because it has fulfilled its purpose. And what once required faith to believe in now simply exists in front of you. If you are here now, it may be because you are standing at the final doorway of your sacred union story, the moment where everything that was once spiritual, unseen, and uncertain becomes grounded in reality. And this moment feels different from everything before it, because it does not arrive with confusion. It arrives with recognition. Something inside you does not question it anymore. It simply knows. And that knowing is not emotional excitement. It is deep inner confirmation. A stillness that says, this is what was always meant to happen. But what makes this stage so powerful is not just the arrival itself. It is the way your entire journey suddenly makes sense. Every delay, every silence, every separation, every emotional collapse that once felt unbearable. They all begin to reorganize in your awareness, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. Not because the past has changed, but because you have changed enough to understand it. And understanding transforms everything. You no longer see your story as random. You no longer interpret pain as abandonment. You no longer view timing as unfair. Instead, you begin to recognize something deeper. Your entire journey was structured. Not chaotic. Not accidental. But precise. Even the parts that broke you were shaping you. Even the moments that confused you were guiding you. Even the people who left were clearing space for alignment you could not yet see. And now, at this final stage, that hidden structure becomes visible in hindsight. This is one of the most sacred emotional experiences a person can have. When suffering finally reveals meaning. Because meaning does not erase pain, but it redeems it. At this point, your sacred union is no longer something you are trying to understand. It becomes something you are witnessing unfold. There is a shift in perception that occurs here. You stop asking, when will it happen? And instead begin recognizing. It is already happening. Not as anticipation, but as observation. You begin noticing how reality responds differently to you. Not dramatically, but consistently. Things that once felt blocked begin moving. Emotional resistance dissolves without effort. Communication patterns shift in subtle but meaningful ways. And synchronicities begin to feel less like signs and more like alignment confirmations. But the most important change is internal. Your emotional dependency on outcomes begins to dissolve. You are no longer emotionally trapped in uncertainty. Because uncertainty no longer defines your state. There is still desire. But it is no longer desperate. There is still love. But it is no longer fearful. There is still connection. But it is no longer unstable. And this emotional stability is what allows sacred union to fully anchor in physical reality. Because what cannot stabilize internally cannot sustain externally. This is why your entire journey had to happen the way it did. You were not being delayed from love. You were being matured into a state where love could exist without distortion. And now, that maturity is becoming evident in your awareness. You begin to feel something unusual. A calm acceptance of everything that has happened. Even the painful parts. Not because they were easy, but because they now make sense in a larger structure. And this acceptance is not resignation. It is integration. A final settling of all emotional fragments into a coherent understanding of your path. At this stage, many chosen ones experience something profound. The end of inner resistance. Not the absence of thoughts, but the absence of emotional conflict with those thoughts. You are no longer fighting your past. You are no longer resisting your present. And you are no longer fearing your future. Instead, there is a quiet alignment with all three. And in that alignment, something extraordinary becomes possible. You begin to live from the reality of what is unfolding, rather than the memory of what was delayed. This shift changes everything. Because when your identity is no longer anchored in waiting, waiting disappears. And when waiting disappears, arrival becomes visible. You may also notice something else happening at this stage. Your connection to your sacred union no longer feels distant in the same way. Even if physical union has not fully manifested yet, the emotional separation begins to dissolve. Not through fantasy, but through energetic clarity. There is a sense that something has already shifted. Something irreversible. Something final in its preparation phase. And now moving into expression. This is often where people begin to experience a form of inner peace that is difficult to explain. It is not excitement. It is not anxiety. It is not even anticipation in the traditional sense. It is certainty without urgency. And that certainty is one of the most powerful indicators that alignment has completed its internal cycle. Because when internal alignment is complete, external manifestation has no resistance left to overcome. At this point, even silence feels different. Earlier in your journey, silence felt like waiting. Now, silence feels like confirmation. A space where everything is already arranged, but not yet fully revealed. And instead of trying to fill that silence with questions, you begin to rest within it. Because you trust it. And trust is the final threshold before fulfillment becomes visible. Something else also changes in this final stage. Your perception of the sacred union itself matures. It is no longer seen as something that will complete you, but as something that will reflect the completeness you have already developed. This is a critical shift. Because sacred union is not about completion through another person. It is about recognition of wholeness through connection. And when two whole individuals meet, the dynamic is no longer dependency. It is amplification, support, expansion, and shared purpose. And now, you are beginning to understand this at a deep level. Not intellectually, but experientially. Because your life has already moved you through the lessons required to embody it. At this final stage, something subtle but powerful becomes clear. You are no longer the version of yourself who began this journey. You are no longer defined by confusion. You are no longer shaped by emotional instability. You are no longer waiting for validation from external outcomes. You have become someone who can hold peace even in uncertainty. And that is what makes fulfillment possible. Because fulfillment does not arrive to those who need it to feel whole. It arrives to those who already embody wholeness. And in that embodiment, everything begins to converge. The timing aligns. The paths synchronize. The connection stabilizes. And what was once delayed begins to unfold naturally into experience. Not as a surprise, but as recognition of what has been forming all along. And as this final chapter closes, the message becomes undeniable. Your sacred union was never lost. It was never canceled. It was never outside your destiny. It was being prepared for a moment where it could finally exist without breaking what it was meant to bless. And now, that moment has arrived. Because what heaven has aligned in spirit is now fully ready to be lived in reality. There is a final turning point in every divine journey where everything becomes simple again. Not because the story has become smaller, but because your heart has finally become still enough to understand it. If you are here right now, it may be because you have reached that final threshold, the place where sacred union is no longer something you are waiting for, analyzing, or hoping to confirm, but something you are being asked to accept. And acceptance is not passive. It is the most powerful form of spiritual alignment. Because acceptance is the moment you stop negotiating with destiny. You stop asking for reassurance. You stop demanding timing to match your expectations. And instead, you step into the quiet recognition that what heaven has written does not require permission to unfold. At this stage of your journey, something subtle but profound begins to happen inside you. You no longer feel the same emotional urgency you once did. The intensity that used to rise when you thought about the outcome begins to soften. Not because the desire is gone, but because the fear surrounding it is dissolving. And in that space, clarity emerges. Clarity that does not shout. Clarity that does not demand. Clarity that simply is. And that clarity carries one message. You are no longer the same person who began this journey. And because you are no longer the same person, your relationship with waiting, longing, and uncertainty must also change. There comes a point where holding on is no longer faith. It becomes resistance. Not because love is wrong, but because attachment to outcome is no longer aligned with your growth. And this is where the final lesson of sacred union begins. You are not being asked to abandon love. You are being asked to release control over how love must appear. Because divine connection does not obey emotional pressure. It obeys alignment. And alignment cannot be forced. It can only be embodied. In this final chapter of your journey, you begin to notice something deeply transformative. You are no longer reacting to your life in the same way. Situations that would once trigger emotional turbulence now pass through you with calm awareness. You observe rather than collapse. You feel rather than resist. You understand rather than overinterpret. And this shift is not emotional numbness. It is emotional mastery. A state where your inner world is no longer controlled by external uncertainty. And that is one of the highest forms of spiritual maturity. Because only in emotional stability can sacred union exist without distortion. Only in inner peace can connection become sustainable. Only in clarity can love remain free from fear. And now that foundation has been built within you. Even if you do not fully recognize it yet. There is also something else happening at this stage that many chosen ones experience, but rarely understand immediately. A sense of distance from your old identity. Not emotionally painful distance, but natural separation. You no longer resonate with certain patterns you once lived in. You no longer feel connected to versions of yourself that were defined by confusion, overthinking, or emotional dependency. It is as if you are remembering who you were before survival shaped your perception. And in that remembering, something sacred occurs. You begin to reclaim your inner authority. You stop outsourcing your peace to external validation. You stop measuring your worth through uncertainty. And you stop defining your future through past emotional pain. This is the point where true freedom begins. Because freedom is not the absence of desire. It is the absence of dependence. And when dependence dissolves, love becomes pure again. Not fragile. Not fearful. Not conditional. But expansive. Stable. And aligned with truth. At this stage, sacred union is no longer a concept in your mind. It becomes a reflection of inner balance. And because your inner state has changed, your outer reality begins to reflect that shift in subtle ways. You may notice emotional neutrality where there used to be intensity. You may notice unexpected peace surrounding topics that once triggered deep longing. You may even notice that certain thoughts simply no longer arise with the same urgency. This is not avoidance. This is completion. And completion is the final phase before manifestation stabilizes. But the most important shift of all happens within your perception of timing. You stop seeing timing as something that is delaying your life. And you begin to see timing as something that has been guiding your life. This change in perception is profound, because it transforms waiting into understanding. And understanding removes suffering from the equation. Now, instead of feeling like you are behind something, you begin to feel like everything has been unfolding in its correct sequence. Even the painful parts. Even the confusing parts. Even the silent parts. All of it begins to make sense from a higher perspective. And in that understanding, a deep emotional release becomes possible. Not dramatic, but peaceful. A letting go of the need to control the narrative. A soft surrender into trust. Not blind trust, but experienced trust. Trust that has survived uncertainty and still chooses peace. And this is where the final choice emerges. Because sacred union always reaches a point where it can no longer be approached as something you chase, analyze, or emotionally depend on. It must be chosen from a place of wholeness. And that choice is not about choosing the outcome. It is about choosing your inner state regardless of outcome. Choosing peace over anxiety. Choosing alignment over fear. Choosing presence over obsession. And choosing trust over control. This is the moment everything becomes aligned at the deepest level. Because heaven does not respond to desperation. It responds to readiness. And readiness is revealed through choice. Not circumstance. Not emotion. But conscious inner positioning. At this stage, something quietly powerful happens. You begin to realize that nothing has been taken from you. Not time. Not love. Not destiny. Everything has been moving toward alignment, even when it felt still. Even when it felt delayed. Even when it felt uncertain. And now, as clarity settles in, you no longer feel like you are waiting for your sacred union. You feel like you are aligned with it. Whether it has fully manifested externally or is still unfolding into physical form, your internal relationship with it has changed completely. And that change is what determines everything. Because reality always reflects the deepest internal truth. And your deepest truth is no longer fear. It is trust. Not because everything is visible, but because everything now feels coherent. And coherence is the language of divine order. So as this final chapter closes, the message becomes simple, but absolute. You are no longer in preparation. You are no longer in delay. You are no longer in uncertainty. You are in alignment. And what is aligned does not remain unseen forever. It becomes reality in its perfect timing. Not because you forced it, but because you finally became the version of yourself capable of receiving it without resistance. And in that state, nothing is missing, nothing is delayed, and nothing is lost. Only unfolding. There is a final stage in every divine journey where even words begin to feel secondary. Because what was once only language becomes lived experience. And what was once only faith becomes physical reality. If you are here now, it may be because you have reached the final chapter of this unfolding story. The moment where everything that has been prepared, refined, delayed, and aligned finally steps into full expression. Not as possibility. Not as hope. But as reality that you can no longer deny. And the most surprising part of this stage is not the arrival itself. It is the calmness that surrounds it. There is no confusion. No emotional chaos. No internal struggle. Instead, there is recognition. A deep, quiet recognition that feels older than thought itself. As if something inside you has been remembering this moment long before it physically arrived. And now, it is simply happening in front of you. At this point in your journey, everything begins to feel different. Not because life has suddenly become perfect, but because your relationship with life has fundamentally changed. You no longer interpret events through fear. You no longer analyze every detail for hidden danger. You no longer anticipate loss before connection can fully form. Instead, you are grounded in something far more stable. Presence. And presence is the final gateway into fulfilled alignment. Because sacred union was never meant to be experienced through anxiety. It was always meant to be experienced through clarity. And clarity does not ask for confirmation. It recognizes truth. In this final stage, many chosen ones experience something that feels almost surreal. The emotional story that once defined their entire inner world begins to dissolve. Not suddenly, but gradually. Like mist disappearing under sunlight. The longing that once felt overwhelming begins to soften. The confusion that once consumed mental space begins to quiet. And the emotional intensity that once shaped every thought begins to fade into a deeper sense of peace. And what replaces it is not emptiness. It is stability. A grounded emotional state where nothing inside you is constantly being pulled apart. This is not detachment from love. This is liberation from fear. And liberation is what allows love to exist in its purest form. At this stage, sacred union is no longer something you think about as coming. It becomes something you recognize as already here. Even if physical circumstances are still unfolding into form, your internal reality no longer waits for validation. Because you have stepped into alignment with what has been written. And when alignment is complete, waiting loses its emotional authority. You may begin to notice that your perception of time itself feels different. Moments feel more present, less fragmented, less scattered across possibilities. You are no longer mentally living in future scenarios or past uncertainties. You are anchored in now. and the now becomes the only place where truth is experienced. This shift is subtle, but it is one of the clearest indicators that sacred union has moved from preparation into manifestation. Because manifestation is not only external. It is first internal coherence becoming stable. At the same time, something else begins to happen in your external reality. The emotional energy surrounding your connection becomes unmistakably different. Where there was once distance, there is now softness. Where there was once uncertainty, there is now quiet recognition. Where there was once silence, there is now movement, even if minimal, even if gradual. This movement does not need to be dramatic to be real. In divine timing, even small shifts carry significant meaning, because they indicate that resistance has dissolved. And when resistance dissolves, flow begins. You may find that communication becomes easier, or that emotional barriers that once felt absolute begin to loosen, or that unexpected reconnections occur without force or confusion. And even if physical reunion is not yet fully complete in every dimension, something irreversible has already changed. The separation no longer feels final. And when separation loses its finality, convergence begins forming naturally. But perhaps the most important transformation in this chapter is internal. You no longer define your identity through waiting. You no longer see yourself as someone trying to get to something. Instead, you recognize that everything you needed to become has already been developed through the journey itself. You are no longer in the process of becoming. You are now in the state of being. And being is the foundation upon which fulfilled connection rests. At this level, your sacred union is no longer experienced as external destiny alone. It is experienced as internal alignment reflected externally. This is why everything begins to feel more coherent. Because coherence is what happens when inner and outer reality are no longer in conflict. There is also a profound emotional realization that emerges in this final stage. Nothing was ever truly lost. Every delay had structure. Every separation had purpose. Every silence had meaning. Even the moments that felt like endings were actually transitions. And now, looking back, you begin to see that your entire path was never random. It was carefully orchestrated toward this exact state of completion. And in that realization, something deep inside you finally relaxes. Not because everything is explained, but because everything is now understood at a level beyond explanation. This is what spiritual completion feels like. Not the absence of questions, but the absence of distress around unanswered questions. Because peace no longer depends on full understanding. It depends on trust that has already been proven through experience. And you have lived through enough of the journey to know that nothing has been meaningless. Even when it didn't make sense. Even when it hurt. Even when it felt like everything was paused. It was all moving toward this moment of integration. And now that integration is complete. At this stage, sacred union is no longer something that arrives in fragments. It arrives as wholeness. A wholeness that reflects both inner maturity and external alignment. And wholeness does not struggle to exist. It stabilizes. It expresses itself naturally. It becomes part of lived reality. And in this final recognition, something becomes undeniably clear. You were never being delayed from your destiny. You were being prepared to live it without breaking it. And now, that preparation has fulfilled its purpose. Because what heaven has aligned within you has now fully aligned around you. And as this final chapter closes, the message is no longer about waiting. It is about fulfillment. Not as promise, but as presence. Because sacred union, when fully realized, is not something you reach. It is something you become ready to live. And now, you are ready. There is a final truth that most spiritual journeys never fully prepare you for. It is not the arrival of sacred union. It is what happens after. Because for so long, your life may have been defined by anticipation, by longing, by inner transformation, by silence that carried meaning even when nothing visible had yet changed. But when the waiting finally ends, something unexpected happens. The story does not stop. It expands. If you are here now, it may be because you have crossed into that rarest stage of all, the space where sacred union is no longer something approaching you, but something you are now living inside of. And at first, this new reality does not feel dramatic. It feels strangely normal. Almost too normal. Because your nervous system, once conditioned to expect delay, resistance, and emotional turbulence, does not immediately recognize stability as real. You may even find yourself silently asking, "Is this really it? Why does it feel so peaceful? Why isn't something going wrong?" But what you are experiencing is not the absence of destiny. It is the arrival of balance. And balance often feels unfamiliar after long seasons of emotional imbalance. This is why the first phase after sacred union often feels like recalibration. Not of circumstances, but of identity. Because the version of you who waited for love is not the same version of you who now lives within it. And that difference changes everything. In this new phase, your relationship with time transforms completely. You are no longer measuring your life in before and after separation. You are no longer mentally living in future outcomes. You are fully anchored in presence. And presence becomes the foundation of your new reality. At first, this presence feels quiet. But gradually it becomes expansive. You begin to notice that your emotional world no longer revolves around uncertainty. There is no constant scanning for signs. No internal tension waiting for something to collapse. No emotional preparation for disappointment. Instead, there is space. Space to breathe. Space to exist. Space to experience connection without fear of its disappearance. And this is one of the deepest forms of healing a human can experience. When love no longer feels like something you must protect from loss, but something you are allowed to simply live. At this stage, sacred union is no longer a destination. It becomes a shared rhythm of life, a natural interaction between two aligned paths. Not perfect, not without challenges, but grounded in something far more stable than emotional dependency. Mutual consciousness, mutual awareness, mutual growth. You begin to understand that union was never about constant intensity. It was about consistent alignment. And alignment does not require emotional extremes to prove itself. It expresses itself through stability, through clarity, through presence that does not disappear when life becomes ordinary. Because divine love was never meant to exist only in dramatic moments of longing or reunion. It was meant to exist in the ordinary flow of life itself. In quiet mornings, in simple conversations, in shared understanding without explanation, in the ability to remain connected without fear of losing connection. And this is where many chosen ones realize something profound. The sacred union they once imagined was often shaped by longing. But the sacred union they are now living is shaped by truth. And truth is far more stable than longing. In this new phase, emotional patterns that once dominated your inner world begin to fade completely. Overthinking loses its grip. Attachment loosens naturally. Old fears lose relevance. Not because you force them away, but because they no longer match your lived reality. You no longer need to imagine outcomes to feel secure. Because security is now part of your lived experience. This is the moment where spiritual growth becomes embodied. Not conceptual, not philosophical, but real, and lived through daily existence. You also begin to notice something subtle but powerful in your connection. There is no longer emotional instability between presence and absence. Distance no longer triggers fear. Silence no longer triggers anxiety. Space no longer feels like loss. Because the connection is no longer defined by proximity. It is defined by alignment. And alignment is not disrupted by physical distance. It exists independently of circumstance. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of sacred union. People often believe it is about constant togetherness. But in truth, it is about sustained resonance. A state where both individuals remain connected through internal coherence, even while navigating external life. And when that coherence is established, fear dissolves naturally. At this stage, your life begins to feel less like something you are trying to control, and more like something you are participating in. You are no longer the observer waiting for change. You are the participant living within it. And participation replaces anxiety with awareness. Another profound shift occurs in how you perceive your past. The events that once felt painful no longer carry the same emotional weight. You can remember them without reopening them. You can acknowledge them without reliving them. You can understand them without being trapped inside them. This is emotional integration at its deepest level. And integration is what allows true peace to remain stable. Because peace is not the absence of memory. It is the absence of emotional captivity to memory. In this stage, even your identity begins to feel different. You are no longer defined by what you went through. You are defined by what you have become through it. And what you have become is someone who can hold both love and stability simultaneously. Someone who no longer confuses intensity with meaning. Someone who understands that true connection does not require suffering to be real. It simply requires truth. As life continues unfolding in this new state, something quietly beautiful begins to happen. You stop seeking confirmation that your path was meaningful. Because meaning is no longer something you are searching for. It is something you are living. And when meaning becomes lived experience, doubt loses its foundation. Even challenges that appear in this phase are experienced differently. They no longer feel like threats to the connection. They feel like shared experiences within it. Opportunities for growth. Moments of alignment refinement. Not separations. Not endings. But evolution within stability. And this is perhaps the most important realization of all. Sacred union does not end your journey. It transforms the way you experience it. You are still growing. Still evolving. Still learning. But now you are doing so from a place of connection rather than fragmentation. From presence rather than absence. From alignment rather than longing. And in that transformation, life itself becomes more grounded. More meaningful. More real. Not because it became perfect, but because it became integrated. So as this final chapter closes, the message becomes clear in its simplest form. The journey was never about reaching union. It was about becoming someone who could live within it. And now that you are here, the waiting is no longer part of your identity. Only the living remains. And what you are living is no longer a promise. It is your reality.